Welcome back to Module 2, Backward Design. The title of today's lesson is Dissecting Learning Targets and an Introduction to Bloom's Taxonomy. In today's lesson, we will cover the following topics. Number 1, the key components of a learning target, and number 2, an introduction to Bloom's taxonomy. Our learning target for today is I will be able to describe key components of a learning target. What is backward design? As a reminder, backward design is the process of designing curriculum, a lesson, or an activity by focusing on the desired outcome first. So we're thinking long term, what do we want our students to do by the end of the lesson? There are 3 phases of backward design. The first phase is identifying the desired outcomes, so naming what learners should be able to understand and do at the end of the lesson. The second phase is identifying acceptable evidence, so how are we going to quiz or assess our students to ensure that they're learning what we want them to learn. And then finally, planning the learning experiences and instruction. So what types of exercises will we build into the lesson in order to have our students meet our target? Our final recap for today is a brief refresher on social and emotional learning and how it benefits everyone. Remember those 5 buckets that we have of self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness are things we want to embed within our lessons. We do not necessarily want to incorporate every single bucket within the lesson. We do, however, throughout the theme or the overarching scope of a lesson, want to ensure that we're hitting on those different buckets so that students are growing in multiple facets of social and emotional growth. Similarly, with non-formal education, since we are in the field of non-formal education, we don't want to forget the fact that we have 4 major components that need to be remembered. So number 1, the goals of non-formal education are for participants to acquire both common and book sense. So common knowledge, academic knowledge, we want to make sure they're getting both throughout the lessons. Number 2, we're focusing on that social and emotional learning. Number 3, non-formal education learning is self-governing, so you should not be lecturing your students for the entire or the majority of time of a lesson duration. And lastly, non-formal education is designed to meet the needs of heterogeneous groups, regardless of their age, their gender, their culture, or their ethnicity. Now that we've reviewed everything from module number 1, as well as taken a brief recap of module number 2's lesson 1, we're going to look at what is a learning target. Learning targets are concrete goals written in student-friendly language that clearly describe what students will learn and be able to do by the end of a class, unit, project, or even a course. They begin with an I can statement and are posted in the classroom. The term target is used intentionally as it conveys to students that they are aiming for something specific. The following criteria is often used to determine if a learning target is strong. So learning targets are strong if number 1, they are written in student-friendly language and begin with the stem I can or I will. Number 2, they are measurable and use concrete accessible verbs, e.g. identify, compare, analyze. The verbs suggest the way in which the target will be assessed. Number 3, learning targets are strong if they are specific, often referring to the context of a lesson, project, or case study. Number 4, learning targets are focused on the intended learning, not the intended doing. So what will students be learning, not what will they be completing. That is, they are phrased as statements about the skills or knowledge students will develop as opposed to what students will complete. So here's a prime example. Number 1, I can describe the ideal habitat for a polar bear versus number 2, I can write a paragraph about the habitat of a polar bear. Looking at those 2 learning targets, which one do you think is the correct choice? If you said, I can describe the ideal habit for a polar bear, you are correct. In that case, we are naming the fact that students will be learning how to describe something. We don't want to focus on the writing portion because that is not an actual skill that they're learning. That's just something that they're going through and proving that they've reached the end of the lesson. So we want to, again, focus on what is the task or skill that students are learning, not what is the task that they are completing. Finally, number 5, learning targets are matched to the cognitive process demanded of students. So cognitive processes are knowledge, reasoning, and skill-based sets, and we want to see how students are using one of those three buckets throughout the lesson. They do not need to use all three within a particular lesson, but we need to try and name one of those three within our learning target. Next, we're going to look at a video from Johns Hopkins University, and it describes using Bloom's taxonomy and how to write learning objectives or learning targets using it. Bloom's taxonomy is a leveled set of verbs that allow us to break down the levels of higher and lower order thinking skills to help us label our learning targets effectively for our students. Again, as you're looking at the video, please don't think that you need to incorporate every single thing that's being mentioned in every single learning target. Instead, remember that these skills that you're developing through this professional development are meant to help you determine what you need to implant into various parts of your lesson plan. So you may only be doing lower level thinking skills within a first lesson of a cycle. But by the end of the lesson, you want kids to get to the point where they are using higher level thinking skills, such as creating something. And as we're watching the video, think about the way in which your lesson scope and sequences are taking learning from a beginning or initial point to a final outcome or project, and how you can express that within your learning targets.
Hello and welcome to this video. In this video, we will learn about Bloom's taxonomy and how to use Bloom's taxonomy to rate learning objectives. Bloom's taxonomy was created in 1956 under the leadership of educational psychologist Dr. Benjamin Bloom in order to promote higher forms of thinking in education, such as analyzing and evaluating, rather than just remembering facts or rote learning. Bloom's taxonomy is a multi-tiered model of classifying thinking according to 6 cognitive domains. The taxonomy is divided into 6 levels of learning, and we can associate action verbs with each of these levels. These 6 levels of learning and the associated action verbs can be used to create learning objectives for your course. Let's take a look at the 6 levels in more detail. Remembering involves retrieving, recognizing, and recalling relevant knowledge from long-term memory. Here are some verbs associated with this level. Understanding means to construct information from oral, written, and graphic messages. Verbs associated with this level might be applying involves carrying out or using a procedure through executing or implementing. Here are some verbs associated with the application level. Analyzing deals with breaking material into constituent parts or determining how those parts relate to one another and to an overall structure. Here are some verbs associated with this level. Evaluating has the learner making judgments based on criteria and standards. Here are some verbs that might be associated with this level. And finally, creating, or putting elements together to form a coherent or functional whole, reorganizing elements into a new pattern or structure. Here are some verbs associated with creating. Like other taxonomies, Bloom's is hierarchical and begins with lower order thinking skills to higher order thinking skills. Bloom's infers that learning at the higher levels is dependent upon having attained prerequisite knowledge and skills at lower levels. You will often see Bloom's taxonomy displayed as a pyramid graphic like the one you see here to help demonstrate the hierarchy. So let's examine how the hierarchical nature of Bloom's taxonomy relates to course design and how a student will learn the concepts in your course. As we've just learned, Bloom's classifies learning from lower order to higher order, and each category of learning builds upon the other. To further clarify this concept, it can be said that before you can understand a concept, you must remember it. To apply a concept, you must understand it. In order to evaluate a concept, you must have analyzed it. And To create an accurate conclusion, you must have completed a thorough evaluation. As you introduce new concepts to students, they will need to understand, remember, and apply the concepts to move forward to the higher order skills, such as analyzing, evaluating, and creating. So as you begin to think about the design of your course, you should first consider the complexity of your content, as well as the learning level of your students, to determine where the majority of the learning should fall. Lower level or introductory courses introduce a variety of skills and new concepts, and therefore have a majority of the learning objectives fall within the lower order thinking skills. Advanced courses often assume that the student comes prepared with the foundational knowledge, and they are now ready to use this knowledge to move on to higher order of thinking and learning, and therefore should contain learning objectives that focus on higher order skills. This is not to say that an introductory course will only accomplish the lower domain, and an advanced course will only accomplish the higher order domain. In fact, every course should have a variety of objectives from each domain. However, how many of the objectives that fall within the lower or higher domains is often dependent upon the content and the level of mastery that the student is expected to achieve. To help instructors select verbs for their learning objectives, we've created what we'd like to call a Bloom's Wheel that contains the levels of Bloom's taxonomy, associated verbs that pertain to each level, and some suggestions of activities that are associated with each level. You can download your own Bloom's Wheel at the link shown on the screen. I'll be showing you how to use it in just a bit. And now that we understand Bloom's taxonomy, let's use what we've learned to construct a measurable learning objective. First, you should start with a STEM sentence. All learning objectives contain a STEM sentence. They are most often written as the STEM sentence with a bulleted list of objectives that follow the STEM. For your course modules, you may want to use the STEM. After completing this module, you will be able to. Next, determine the learning outcome. Think about what it is that you want the students to be able to do, and then think about how you will know that they understand what you've taught them. What is the outcome or product that they will do or produce that demonstrates that they've mastered the concept? I'll use this particular presentation as an example. When designing this video, I identified that I wanted the participants to know the 6 levels of Bloom's taxonomy. I then asked myself, how will I be able to determine that the learners understand Bloom's taxonomy? What can they do to demonstrate that they've mastered this concept? From this point, we'll move on to step 3. Consult the Bloom's Wheel to determine the appropriate level of learning and select an appropriate verb that reflects exactly what you want the learners to do. So, let's take a look at the Bloom's Wheel. I'll note that this helpful tool is available to you online. Simply point your browser to ep.jhu.edu/blooms, and you'll be able to download a PDF of this tool. Okay, back to the wheel. We'll see that the wheel contains 6 levels of learning or cognitive domains in the center, suggested measurable action verbs for each domain, and a few examples of learning activities and assessments that fall within each domain. You should use your Bloom's Wheel to help you select verbs, activities, and assessments for your course. However, it is important to note that the suggested verbs are not all-inclusive, and you should feel free to use other verbs that you may think of if they better describe the action your student will be performing. Now, let's refer back to my example of trying to determine how I will know that my learners understand the 6 levels of Bloom's taxonomy. Note that I use the word understand, but I will not include this in my objective as it is far too vague and therefore not easy to measure or assess. We want our learning objectives to be targeted and more descriptive so that we are able to assess the outcome of the learner's performance. When thinking of my scenario, I first consider the fact that the introduction of Bloom's taxonomy is for the most part foundational knowledge, and most likely a new concept for my learners. Therefore, I can determine that I'll want the objective to fall within the lower order domains, but I know that I want my learners to be able to remember the 6 categories of Bloom's, understand how they apply to learning, and demonstrate that they can apply this knowledge to eventually be used in their own course design. This brings me up to the application level. I then think about an activity that will provide me with a way to measure whether or not my learners can do these things. After looking at the suggested activities and verbs, I decide that I will have them classify learning objectives within the 6 levels of Bloom's taxonomy. This will demonstrate that they not only know the levels, but that they can both understand and apply this knowledge. Okay, so we are now ready to move on to step 4, which is to write out our actual learning objective. Classify learning objectives within the 6 cognitive domains of Bloom's taxonomy. We now have a student-centered, measurable learning objective that we can later use to design an activity, assessment, and related teaching strategies to be associated with this objective. For example, I could develop a learning objective classification activity that participants would complete after they view this presentation. After this, I'm ready to move on to designing my next objective for this module using the same process. Now that we've learned how to use Bloom's taxonomy to help us write learning objectives, and as you work through developing a course design matrix for your course, you should strive to write strong learning objectives. As we learned in the other video on course and learning objectives are measurable, observable statements of what students will be able to do at the end of a unit of learning. So, with this in mind, it is important to emphasize that strong learning objectives do not include vague or immeasurable terms. Terms like understand, know, appreciate, become familiar with, learn, and be aware of are much too vague and almost impossible to assess. Use the Bloom's wheel provided to you to help you select strong action verbs that will describe exactly what the learner will do. This will help to ensure that you are writing specific, measurable, and observable objectives that will provide a solid foundation for your course design. This concludes this video. Thanks for watching.
John Hopkins does a great job in trying to explain how a learning target can be scripted using Bloom's taxonomy. And here up on the screen, we do have a visual representation of Bloom's taxonomy using a light bulb. So starting at the bottom layer, we know that that's our lower level order of thinking skills. We want to take our students from that knowledge-based level all the way up to the higher order thinking skills of evaluation throughout the course of whether it's a module or a cycle or even the week that we may be instructing them at SIA. So using this infographic, which I will be including in Google Classroom, can help you develop and write stronger learning targets that align with something that is more accessible for not only your students, but for you as well as their educator. We want to make sure we're writing learning targets that we can have a measurable outcome for. So using the specific verbs that's in this layout of Bloom's taxonomy can definitely help you reach that goal. Additionally, this is not the only way that Bloom's taxonomy is usually depicted. We will see representations at other points of it being in a matrix type format as well as in a pyramid. Whichever infographic catches your eye or is more appealing to you, go for it. The point is that you're using these words that is outlined in this taxonomy in the levels that it's outlined to help you write a learning target that is aligned with what is actually occurring for that specific lesson. I know that there was a lot of information in today's lesson, and I appreciate the fact that you're taking the time to absorb all of the information that's being given to you. Tomorrow, we're going to take what we're learning today, and we are going to write 5 sequential learning targets on a theme. Now, to be beneficial to you in your role at SIA, we're going to allow you to use the current activity that you are teaching or you were teaching or are preparing to teach upon our return to school. So if you are someone that is currently teaching a STEM-based activity, you're going to create 5 sequential learning targets for that area of expertise that you have. If you have questions about how to go about doing this, please let me know by reaching out to me via email or telephone. Well, you guys know the deal by now. Reaching the slide means you've completed the lesson for today. If you have questions, please reach me at ray.badal@saya.org or via the telephone number I included in my introductory email to each of you. Thank you for completing Lesson 2 in Module 2 Backward Design. Remember to head over to the Google Classroom and complete the quiz for this corresponding lesson. Take care, everyone, and have a great day.